From Deloitte Tax, welcome to the Tax News and Views podcast. In this series, we talk to specialists about the latest business issues and developments. I'm Carrie Falkenhayn, your host for Tax News and Views. And we're very excited today to have the CEO of the Global Business Alliance, or GBA as it's also known, Nancy McLernon. She's here joining us today to talk about what is going on with the GBA. That is an organization that's focused on improving U.S. competitiveness and attracting foreign investments into the U.S. And here at Deloitte, we certainly see non-U.S. headquartered companies investing in the U.S. as a strategic and growing market segment that has its own special needs and needs special assistance from experts specifically trained to understand their very specific needs. The objective of this discussion is to talk more about this market segment, U.S. inbound companies. So Nancy, welcome to the podcast. We're really glad to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
And so tell us, let's just start off you telling us a little bit about GBA and its focus. What is it all about? How was it started? How do you assist and support foreign investors?
Yeah, great. So the Global Business Alliance is really the premier advocacy organization that works on issues that uniquely impact the inbound business community. Currently, we have about 200 globally recognized brands across every sector in the U.S. economy. And we sort of harness the power of the inbound business community to improve America's political and policy environment. So for 30 years, folks might know that we were the Organization for International Investment. In March of 2020, we changed our name to the Global Business Alliance to better represent who our companies are. And I actually started the organization in 1990. So all I have focused on is inbound companies for the last 32 plus years. So I see the inbound community as an industry in and of itself, focusing on those unique issues. But we lobby on issues that we believe makes the United States less competitive for foreign direct investment. We want inbound companies to have the same ability to succeed in the U.S. economy as any other company doing business here.
Well, congratulations on over 30 years of being in business. Your
Thanks
success in doing and achieving your mission. So one of the things we saw in your most recent reports is that the U.S. is receiving less cross-border investment than it had historically, down by more than 10%. Can you talk a little bit about the reasons for this? And is it something that we should be worried about? And do you think it's going to be a long-term trend?
So these numbers change quite a bit. And actually, the most recent numbers is a rebound from the low teens we saw a decade ago. So over the past 2 decades, the European market has remained fairly stable as a location for foreign direct investment. And over the last decade, the U.S. has regained its share over the past decade.
That's good news. That's good news. And is it specific things that the U.S. government is doing to attract foreign investments? And how does that compare maybe to what other countries are doing?
So for a long time, the federal government did not have an agency that was focused on attracting foreign direct investment. It was sort of left to the states to do that. As the administration started realizing that it was hard for, say, Ohio to compete against Germany, that the federal government needed to do more. So during the Obama administration, they created an agency called Select USA. And that is the first time that there has been a federal agency that is particularly devoted to international, attracting foreign direct investment. But there are many reasons why international companies come here, from our large consumer market, our world-class research universities, to our relatively stable regulatory environment and solid infrastructure makes the United States a really good place to invest. In terms of policy, like the Bipartisan Infrastructure and CHIPS Act, GBA worked to ensure that international companies have the same opportunities as domestic companies. Some of it was more work than others, but we were successful in ensuring those equal opportunities. In terms of other policies, I think there are 3 major areas that affect America's economic competitiveness for foreign direct investment. Number one is national security. So this is an emerging area of focus for policymakers that impact cross-border investment. There is an organization or an agency called CFIUS. It represents the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. And CFIUS reviews foreign acquisitions of U.S. companies that could have a national security impact. And we work to ensure that those reviews are not politicized, but are actually reviewed based on true national security. And unfortunately, there have been times that CFIUS review gets politicized. So we work on that area. Another one is outbound screening. So this is when a company in the United States invests outside the United States, which would include U.S. subsidiary. There are proposals to regulate that area. We believe that would make the U.S. less competitive for foreign direct investment. Number two is forced localization rules, or Buy American. This is another area where we've seen growing policy interest with government procurement and tax policy rules designed to force production in the United States. Don't get me wrong, international companies actually embody making things in the United States. In fact, without exception, inbound companies have made, this deliberate decision to invest here, create jobs here, invest in communities. And the largest sector for foreign direct investment is in manufacturing. So our companies are manufacturing here, not just to serve the US consumer market, but actually consumers around the world. So they export quite a bit. And then finally, third, tax policy, focused on America's tax code. And no company makes its decision based solely on a company's tax policy, but it does have an impact. So when companies are comparing the US with one or two alternative jurisdictions, there are areas in our tax policy that make the United States a little less competitive for foreign direct investment. And I'm sure your listeners are quite familiar with these. One is BEAT. The Global Business Alliance actually worked pretty successfully during the Build Back Better discussion when President Biden was working to pass, this very large social infrastructure bill. There were a number of provisions, tax provisions in that bill that we successfully worked on. We worked on, for example, preventing about $95 billion in discriminatory international tax policy in this Congress. Another thing we're working on is 174, research and development. This is one issue that I hope Congress will address quickly. I'm not overly optimistic, but allowing companies that are investing here, into tomorrow's discoveries on R&D to be able to deduct that business expense will restore what has been an effective engine for American innovation.
Well, you obviously know foreign investors well and inbound companies well. What do you think the areas are that they really need help and assistance when they're making their decision to invest, both to make their investment decision and then for them to be successful?
Okay, so I'm going to hit on about 6 issues in that. So number one, I've already mentioned forced localization, Buy America, both at the federal and the state level. So GBA works both at the federal and the state level. As your listeners may know, our states have sovereignty and they don't have to adhere to our international trade or tax treaties. So working at the state level is really important. So that forced localization, Buy America is one area. One of the areas that is an emerging challenge for Democratic policymakers is how to reconcile ambitious climate goals with maintaining ardent union support. So this administration really believes that what put them over the edge in terms of winning was labor. But there is this sort of pull between climate goals and maintaining this support for unions. Climate change is a global challenge, and we'd be much better prepared to tackle it if policies from EV infrastructure to the SEC's corporate climate disclosure requirements, if they recognize kind of the global nature of the problem and embrace a more collaborative cross-border approach. Number three, the fact is that other countries, particularly Europe and Japan, are further down the road on addressing these issues, right, on climate issues. And as a result, companies from those countries, many of which are our members, are global leaders in the climate space. But unfortunately, instead of embracing the best of what the world has to offer in this area, we're seeing efforts to force localized development, production, and manufacturing of these sustainable solutions. As a result, our federal government and states are arbitrarily walling off our economy, which could really damage their ability to reach their own climate goals. In New York, for instance, Governor Hochul declared in her state speech that she'd cut 80% of New York City's power plant emissions by 2030, in part with the construction of a mega wind project. This legislation has also passed state vehicle requirements for EV vehicles. The problem is they've set vague, restrictive procurement policies, sacrificing off-the-shelf, ready-to-go climate change solutions for costly and inefficient kind of wall-off economic policy. Again, this pull between climate policy and focusing on the unions has been difficult. And then finally, the reality is we should be working, as I've mentioned, with like-minded nations to address the climate crisis and leverage, those cross-border connections to address this global threat. And international companies, as I mentioned, are leaders in this space. And so when they kind of import their climate policy to the United States, that's a good thing. And we don't want to push that away.
That is all very interesting and certainly top of mind with the sustainability and climate goals that organizations and nations and local governments have at this time. Nancy, which countries do you expect to see the largest investments into the U.S. over the next few years?
Really interesting question. So Germany's investment stock in the U.S. has increased by more than 80% over the past 5 years. So that country has moved from fourth place to second place, and we expect more German investment because it's growing pretty rapidly. So during that same period, South Korea increased its total investment in the U.S. by more than 70%. So that is rising from the 16th rank country to now the 12th. Japan was the fourth fastest growing country by foreign direct investment in the U.S., moving from second to first place in 2021. And between 2015 and 2020, the Netherlands, Brazil, and Canada each increased their investment in the U.S. by at least 40%. It's also worth noting that the UK has seen a net divestment from the United States over the past 5 years, falling from about $580 billion in 2016 to $565 billion last year. So it's gone down about 4%. And then finally, while there is a lot of attention around China's investment over the past, for a really long time, Congress has paid a lot of attention to it. You've seen it in the news a lot. It's actually fallen over the past 5 years. So I think it's a combination of stricter scrutiny on foreign direct investment by CFIUS, as I mentioned early, as well as China's Communist Party has sort of discouraged cross-border investment. And I think that's important and worth noting. So those are the countries that I would call out that we could expect more investment from over the next 3 to 5 years.
I've really enjoyed this discussion, Nancy. Anything else you want to share with our listeners before we have to call it?
So I would just add that if any of your clients, inbound clients, in the tax space, want to find out more information about the Global Business Alliance, interested in the policies, we also help our members with compliance and planning. So we try to be, kind of this comprehensive resource for tax executives at inbound companies.
Terrific. And Nancy, if they wanted to reach you or the organization, globalbusinessalliance.com, is that where you go?
Well, actually, so if people want to reach me, it's McLernon, which is McLernon at globalbusiness.org. And so happy to answer any questions that any of your listeners have.
Terrific. Thank you for that. And if listeners want information on Deloitte's inbound tax services as well, you can just Google that on Deloitte.com. But thank you so much, Nancy, for sharing this interesting discussion. And thank you all for joining us and listening in. I hope you all continue to be well. Take care, everyone.